The Outsider podcast shares the opinions and analyses of Drew Landry. They are his thoughts and his thoughts alone, and do not necessarily reflect every member of his audience or newsletter readers. Now, on with the show.
Welcome in to another episode of the Outsider Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Drew Landry, and thank you for tuning in to the Top Politics Podcast west of I-35. In today's show, I get into what should be said when people go vote by the election workers, and I start by going over the SAVE Act, what it is, what it isn't, and how we should really think about this, or at least what I think everyone should think about it. So without any further ado, let's just get into it here. You may have heard a lot about this over the last week or so concerning, and this is the full version of it, because SAVE is an acronym. And so the full version of this is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. Okay, that's what SAVE means. Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. And you've heard something about it, and we're going to get into the context as to what that is, okay, and how that has surrounded this whole conversation. And what we have to remember is the analysis that has derived from several media outlets. And according to that analysis, the SAVE Act would absolutely give the federal government more power over states and how the states run their elections. And the states really have their own type of method of running their elections, okay? That's usually how states do it. I mean, that's usually a state power. That's a state issue, all right? So the SAVE Act is just going to assume, and I guess if you want to say the word usurp, a lot of that state power. According to the Wall Street Journal, which is no liberal publication, the SAVE Act would require new applicants to provide documentary evidence of citizenship at the time of registration. Acceptable documentation would include a U.S. passport, certain military identification cards, or a real ID compliant driver's license that specifically indicates citizenship. Applicants without these forms of ID could submit a birth certificate that meets the strict criteria, including a state seal and authorized signature. Where I'm still quoting here from the Wall Street Journal. For voters who have already registered, the legislation would require states to take affirmative steps to identify and remove non-citizens from voter rolls. States would be directed to submit voter registration data to the Department of Homeland Security's Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements. Okay, that's also SAVE. So they'd have to submit their voter registration data to the DHS SAVE database and use the Social Security Administration's records for verification. Federal agencies would be required to respond to verification requests within 24 hours without charging a fee. Beginning in 2027, the bill would impose a federal photo identification requirement for voting. In-person voters would have to present a valid government-issued photo ID. Mail voters, those who vote by mail, would need to include a copy of identification or provide the last four digits of their Social Security number along with an affidavit. That is the piece, the quote that I took from the Wall Street Journal. Here's what else it would do. It would greatly limit the ability to vote by mail. as we look at what was reported by PBS, the bill requires mail-in applicants to provide proof of citizenship when registering to vote by mail. So if you are going to ask for a mail-in ballot, you would have to provide proof of citizenship, including the steps it already takes to vote by mail. So all this is happening, and you have to ask this question. There's this basic thing here. Why? What's the problem? Okay? What issue is being addressed here? So what's the why? Why is this happening? Well, look, folks, let's just be clear here. The answer is incredibly transparent. You can bring it down to one word: politics. We're coming right back to the root of all this, is that President Donald Trump still seethes. He's still very mad. He still pouts about it, that he fairly and honestly lost the 2020 presidential election. He'll never admit that. Instead, he continues to choose the path of division. And while he's on this path, he has essentially thrown a giant-sized hammer at the foundation of federalism to say states can no longer run elections as they see fit. That's what's happened here. And, there was even this call in to another audio program where he said Republicans should just nationalize it. They should just take the election. They should just have it. I mean, I just want people to think here. I just want an honest thought. That imagine if Joe Biden said this. Again, this goes back to that point that I made about the right, how they get to say this sort of stuff, and the left can't. I mean, imagine if Joe Biden said, we need to nationalize these elections. The Democrats should just take it over. I mean, the right would lose their minds. They would just completely, their heads would just blow off their shoulders. Or imagine if Barack Obama said this, or Bill Clinton, or even Jimmy Carter. If any of those Democrats, when they were in office, said anything like this, the right would be in a complete uproar. But the Democrats didn't say this. A Republican president said that the elections need to be nationalized. He then goes on to say, by the way, because this SAVE Act, it actually passed the House of Representatives. It did. It goes on to the Senate. The Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, has already said it's dead on arrival. It's DOA. And I'll talk about why that's the case later on here. But the president went on to say that there'll be federal voting ID regardless, because he's going to sign in an executive order saying this. It needs to be very clear here that these executive orders are meant to enforce current law or the Constitution or establish some sort of regulation of the executive branch. It's not creating new laws. That needs to be very clear. The president is not creating laws. That's the legislature's job. That's Congress's job. Now, we can talk about whether Congress has done a good job on that, and believe me, we can go back 150 years on this. I mean, regardless of party, there's a long history of Congress just dinking around and being stupid. Regardless of that, it's still Congress's job. And for the president to just simply say it will happen is going to lead to a lawsuit. And that lawsuit needs to be played out as we check and balance a strong executive in the White House, who, quite frankly, is going beyond everything. Now, there's so many tangents that I can go down here. I'm going to keep things straight and keep it to the SAVE Act, because this is all happening because of politics. Because Trump will never admit that he lost the election, that he lost 2020. He'll never admit that. He could have, and we wouldn't be where we are today. I want to make that clear. He could have said, I lost. And I've said this before. I don't need to repeat that. But it's very clear why this is happening. Because he feels that he really didn't lose, and that he only lost because of non-citizens who voted. That there was cheating, that there was rigging, and all. I mean, all of this traces back to his grievances of the narrative that he helped shape about the 2020 election. All of this. And I have to break this myth. Myths have to be broken. They have to be busted. And so the author and main sponsor of this bill is Congressman Chip Roy out of Texas, who's running to be the next Attorney General. And there are many myths that he, Congressman Roy, and the president repeat. And the biggest, one of the most blatant falsehoods that's out there is that non-citizens register to and vote in our elections in massive droves. And then they talk about how Biden's inability to secure the border was on purpose and therefore was meant to pack these cities for the 2030 census. This is nuts, by the way. And I just want people to remember, before I get into more stuff about how false all this is, the 2020 census was done when Donald Trump was president. So if you have a problem with the 2020 census, your grievance is with this current president about what he did 6 years ago. Has nothing to do with Biden. Now, do I think Biden did a decent job on the border? No, I don't. I think that and inflation were the two biggest issues that people will really remember about him. You really have to dig deeper. The exit out of Afghanistan is also not really a big part of his legacy. But what he always should have talked about was how employment was always good. The unemployment numbers were incredibly low. Inflation was not. And as an observer, you have to admit where things are. And he didn't really have a good policy for border security, nor for inflation. But to think that this was on purpose is just a whole other level of silliness. Okay? Just a whole other level of dumb. And look, I've often liked Joe Biden. I've always thought that he shot from the hip, and you always knew you were getting some sort of honesty from the guy. It's been that way for a long time. The Straight Talk Express, as he mentioned that in 2004 and even in 2008. Just straight talk, just straight up Joe. 2020, in his 4 years of being president, let's just be clear here, he didn't have a policy on much of anything when it came to the border. Okay, when it came to border security, it just wasn't much there. That's a key criticism. But to think this was on purpose, that's another complete myth. So, that aside, that is a myth that had to be busted. It's untrue that he just brought in a bunch of people just to pack the numbers for the 2030 census. That is a total load of malarkey. But getting back to what I was saying here, how it was this nefarious plan that Congressman Roy and the president have said that a lot of non-citizens register to and vote in our elections in just complete droves. Folks, that is patently and 1,000%, if there's able to be 1,000%, false. It's total false. There are many sources to cite with this. And I'm going to talk about a few of them, but I want you to be very clear about one of them. It actually came from the Trump administration itself. It actually came from the president's own administration. It found, through the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, it found roughly 10,000 non-citizens who were registered to vote out of 49.5 million registered voters. 10,000, let's just say 50 million, just to keep things honest here. Just to like, keep things like round, like whole numbers. 10,000 out of 50 million. I'm going to do some math here while I'm on the air, and it's a good thing that I have a calculator because, it's not always my strong suit. So we take 10,000, divide that into 50. Let's see, 50 million, and multiply by 100. That is 0.022% right there. 0.02%. That's the percentage of non-citizens who were voters, who registered to vote. That the Trump administration's that's their numbers, folks. That's their numbers. That was reported by the New York Times. Those numbers were given from DHS and DOJ to the New York Times. So already, the president's own numbers has already made it clear that this is a farce. Moreover, you look at the Cato Institute, which is a conservative think tank. The Cato Institute used state-level data to debunk this myth even more. The study that they used, and I linked this in, I'll show it here for you. The study that they used evaluated that very claim in states: Arizona, Georgia, Idaho, Louisiana, Michigan, Montana, Utah. States that the president won in at least 2 of 3 elections. So we're talking 2016, 2020, 2024. And the Cato Institute found them overwhelmingly false. Found those claims that the president was making about non-citizens voting in droves and changing elections to be overwhelmingly false. To amplify this point, the Cato Institute's final thoughts on this were that politicians and public interest groups don't actually care that much about election security. The constant talk of non-citizen voting is more likely about scoring political points and bolstering fundraising. 100%. That is totally true. We look at, here's another study, the Center for Election Innovation and Research, CEIR. It investigated many of those states. Found the same thing that the Cato Institute found. Over 96% of voters in our elections are American citizens. Over 96%. Those who are non-citizens tallied 0.004% of our voters. So I want to be clear here. The claim that non-citizens vote in droves and that they are essential to changing elections and that they have a huge influence in election outcomes. This has been completely debunked. Completely debunked. So next, let's look at this other president's claim about voter fraud. And why do I bring this up? Because this is, again, relevant. Because the president continually insists that the 2020 election was rigged due to voter fraud. Which, I want to make another thing clear here. The president, that claim has never been verified. And evidence was never suggested. He actually held a press conference to say, I'm going to have the evidence for you. And then when it was time for him to bring up the evidence, he canceled the press conference because it wasn't there. I have to reiterate here that the president had 62 cases in court in front of both Republican and Democratic presidents who appointed these justices to the court. And he lost every one of them. He didn't win a single case of fraud, of rigging, of all the other stuff you could think of. All of it was found to be false. He didn't win a single case. And so we know what he tried to do. We know what he tried to do on January 6th of 2021. We know. But the reason all this voter fraud stuff is relevant is because Trump is just whining. And he can't accept the fact that he's a loser. Hey, look, take it from one. No one needs to remind me of the elections that I've lost. I'm well aware. The voter fraud, all that, and the 2020 election and all that stuff aside, it needs to be said again. Voter fraud is incredibly rare in our elections. The Heritage Foundation, another conservative think tank, actually has an interactive election fraud database on its website. And it holds records of such cases that have proven criminal convictions or guilty pleas of voter fraud. Because that's a crime, and it should be a crime. And you should be punished for committing such. But what needs to be very clear, again, I say that a lot because there's all this malarkey that's out there. And since 2005, Texas has had a whopping 113 proven criminal convictions or guilty pleas of voter fraud. That's since 2005. 113 proven criminal conviction cases or guilty pleas. Do you have any idea as to how many ballots have been cast since 2005? Just a rough guess. We are talking over tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of ballots have been cast since 2005. We're talking we're talking 21 years. We're close to about 100 million ballots being cast. It's just, throw a dart at it, rough estimate. And they found 113 proven criminal cases. That is such a minuscule number. That is just a small number of cases. God. Voting irregularities happen in every election and in every state. And yes, I want to say something here. There are some chicanery of fraud that takes place, but to even think that it happens on a large scale, that even to think that it's widespread, that even that it's a coordinated event, that the president and his supporters want you to believe is just completely false. It doesn't happen that way. But, what the president doesn't want you to know is about the election lady up in California who tried to actually mess with the voting machines. She actually tried to mess with that. And that's a state crime. She's in jail. The president's trying to pardon her trying to find some way to get her out of jail because she did it under his name. While advocates of the SAVE Act may argue that those who oppose this don't want safe and secure elections, folks, that's a bunch of malarkey. That's such a bunch of garbage. Because, folks, we already have secure elections in our country. Non-citizens cannot vote in our elections. It's been that way for over 100 years. Go look it up. And if they do, and if fraudulent behavior happens, they are isolated, rare, and prosecuted instances. I think a better concern is about what this new voting bill does for married women, but I'll address that at another time. Now, I know what some may actually say to me. Well, Drew, they'll bring out these pushback arguments and how I'm against, the federal government getting involved in state-run elections and all that, how I'm saying this. And say, well, what about the Voting Rights Act of 65? That was a federal intervention. Yeah, you're right. Such a stupid factoid, by the way. This is way on different scales. The Voting Rights Act of 65 is to right a wrong. And that wrong was that across the country, you had states that curbed voting rights based on race, creed, color. Those are what was called Jim Crow laws. Okay. That were supplanted in states to suppress the vote of African Americans. That needed to be addressed. There's no question about it. Voting is a civil right. Come on, people. Voting is a civil right. And the government has an obligation of maintaining equality in the ballot box. The SAVE Act doesn't do any of that. The SAVE Act is for politics and politics alone. Period. The end. And America doesn't need that. Doesn't need it. We don't need the SAVE Act. Now, as I mentioned before, the House passed it. The Senate has yet to take it up. But I want to tell you just a little bit about Senate procedure. There's this thing called the filibuster. And one way to avoid a filibuster is by invoking this thing called cloture. Cloture means to end the debate and you bring about a vote. The Senate has its own way of setting up the rules, just like the House has its own way of setting up the rules. Okay, they get to set their own. They are their own universe. They are separate, independent, yet equal in power chambers of Congress. And the Senate has archaic rules. Let's just be honest. And so in order to invoke cloture, a senator needs, there's certain procedure for this, but overall, the basic, what it boils down to is that it has to have 3/5 of the chamber to invoke cloture, to end debate. If cloture is invoked, the debate ends, a vote on the issue happens. If cloture is not invoked, the debate continues. And it can continue into perpetuity, known as a filibuster. So let's be clear about this. The Republicans have a majority in the Senate, right? They gained that from the 2024 election. There's just no ands, ifs, or buts about it. But they don't have 60 votes. They don't have 60 senators. And so if a cloture vote came up, it would fail. And there would even be some Republicans to join them in that. Because, let's remember here, about 4 years ago when Texas Democrats bolted, 4 or 5 years ago, bolted to Washington, D.C. to break quorum here in Texas over a voting law. They wanted the House, they wanted the Senate to bring up a new set of voting rights, to bring up to revive pre-clearance. That's a whole other thing too. And that failed. The Senate didn't have the votes for cloture, and the vote failed. Lisa Murkowski was very much against it then. She's against it now. She's against the SAVE Act now. So it's quite clear that if this is brought up and a cloture motion is brought to the floor, it will not reach the 60 votes. Here's where you can get crafty. Nothing in the Constitution says about a filibuster. There's nothing in there. It's a long-standing Senate tradition. Traditions can be ended. We've seen this done with judges. All right? Harry Reid broke that, did that when he was the majority leader in 2013 for lower courts. Mitch McConnell broke that for Supreme Court nominees in 2017. Will John Thune, Senate Majority Leader Thune, do this for the SAVE Act? President Trump wants to get rid of the filibuster. He's made it clear. There are other members of the cabinet who want to get rid of the filibuster. There are some senators who want to get rid of the filibuster on the Republican side. Most of the Democrats want to get rid of the filibuster too. But John Thune, Majority Leader Thune, has bristled at this. He doesn't want to get rid of the filibuster. So this is supposed to come up for a cloture vote at some point. Will there be procedure to get rid of the filibuster? Well, the president hopes for it. So the SAVE Act right now doesn't. It's all it's done is pass the House. It's waiting for action in the Senate, and I think the only action it's going to get is a cloture vote, and that'll be the end of it. Again, I could be wrong. Maybe Senate Majority Leader Thune gets rid of the filibuster, and they have an up or down vote right then and there. Maybe that happens. I don't think it will. But it's quite clear that the SAVE Act is not. It's not settling anything. It isn't. It's just promoting the constant grievances that the president has had over the last elections. And he knows that his approval ratings that are so abysmal, abysmal is what I should say, are so awful that's going to affect Republicans in the midterm. Now, again, I'm saying this in February. Things can change. Things can change. You know that. I know that. Public opinion is fluid. It is not all at one time. But if things were to be had now, and if things stay the way that they are, the president's going to, his party's going to lose the Congress. I don't know about the Senate, maybe, but you never know. The House, definitely. Pretty sure. Pretty confident in that. But that said, so he knows that's going to happen. So what can you do? Well, you can have states gerrymander in the mid-decade. That happened. That's still going on. The next thing that you can do is try to make it harder for people to vote on a false pretense. And here you go. This is it. well, we're basically having if all the states who are gerrymandering continue to gerrymander, it's just going to be a wash. The Democratic states, would gain about 10 seats. The Republican states would gain about 10 seats, and there's no advantage to it. But I'm here to tell you that would come back and bite you, because regardless of how these districts are drawn, public opinion is still public opinion. I don't think it's a wise move. But, the president isn't calling me, and if he was, he's really desperate for thoughts. So it's very clear. The SAVE Act is only meant to make it harder for people to vote without any sort of real on false pretenses. If you can't win election fair and square through the public square, through the public in a decade by decade drawn map, then you try to gerrymander, and then you kicked off the domino. All right? And then you realize that's not going to work. The other thing you can do is just try to make it harder for people to vote on a false pretense. And then, if it doesn't pass the Congress, then I'll just make up some reason to bring out an executive order. Again, I just want you to think here. How would the right respond? No, wrong word. React. If a Democrat did what President Trump is doing. And I'm here to tell you, day one of 2029, and I'm fairly certain that, if this continues on, the president's party's not going to win in 2028. President Trump has opened up a whole set of executive powers, a whole wide load of executive powers that hasn't been seen in, if ever, maybe since FDR. But the current president has set this up so that his successor has a lot of wiggle room. And that's going to be the fault of the Republicans. That needs to be clear. They're the ones who are starting this. All right. Last thing I want to say here has to do with voting. Now, when I'm recording this, early voting for the March Texas primaries is taking place. And early voting is something that Texans enjoy. Most Texans vote in early voting. It's Texas was one of the first states to bring this out. It's been around since the late 1980s. I think it's interesting as to how this became a thing in the early 2000s. But that aside, what people in Texas, what they're supposed to tell you is to have your photo ID ready. In Texas, there are 7 acceptable forms of photo identification. As of right now, a driver's license is one of them, and that's really the most popular one. So you'll have some workers who will say, have your driver's license ready. Oh no, you're not supposed to say that. And I specifically will go vote with my passport, because I want them to say to me, have your driver's license ready. All right. So I can say to them, there are 7 acceptable forms of photo identification, and you're supposed to say photo ID. In a nice way, I haven't really seen or heard that a lot in Lubbock, but in your smaller counties, like in Hockley County, which is west of Lubbock County, maybe in Lamb County, which is northwest of Lubbock County, or in Hale, or in Floyd, or Crosby, or Lynn County, you might have election workers who will say, make sure you have your driver's license ready. Not supposed to say that. They're supposed to say photo ID. And here's what they're also not supposed to do. Is say, here's your insert primary ballot here. And look, West Texas is predominantly Republican. And what a lot of these people will say is that they'll just assume every primary voter is a Republican. And so they'll say, here's your Republican ballot. Not supposed to do that either. The voter chooses what primary that they want to vote. The voter chooses that. Texas has an open primary. Like you could say semi-open primary. But the fact that you get to choose what party primary in which you want to vote, them coming up to you and saying, here's your Republican primary ballot. No. Nope. Can't do it. They can't do that. So why am I telling you this? Because I want you to be careful. I want you to be mindful when you go vote. I want you to listen for that. Now, it takes a lot of gumption to say, hey, look, you got that wrong. You're not supposed to do that. When it comes to that, I don't care. Now, obviously, I would not want to embarrass my wife or anyone of my family if I did something like that. But at the same time, you got to be mindful of the law. And these people are trained. They're trained to be a poll worker, and they know better, or they should. So bear in mind here that you're supposed to listen for photo ID, and they are not to hand you a primary ballot until you request one. Okay? All right. That's it for me, folks. This is a fairly short episode. It's shorter than the last one. Had a listener come up to me and say, hey, look, your podcasts are a little too long here. Any chance you can shorten them down? And so that's what I'm doing. I'm going to make them a little shorter. Appreciate you listening. I'll be back again real soon, and I'll see you then.
The preceding analyses and opinions were that of Drew Landry and his alone. They did not necessarily reflect all of his podcast listeners or newsletter readers. Thank you for listening to the Outsider Podcast. Be sure to follow The Outsider on X and on Facebook. Also, don't forget to sign up to be a free subscriber to his newsletter on Substack. Just look for The Outsider. We will see you again next time.